Merhabalar, günaydın.
Good morning. Warm welcome to our international conference on countering hate speech in media. This particular panel will address issues on online hate speech in Turkey and Europe. Professor Ülkü Doğanay has already given us a great overview how we can best make use of this framework and how we can theorize it. My name is Nazan Haydari. I'm a faculty member of Istanbul Bilgi University Department of Media Studies. In the last 4 years, I've been contributing to the Media Watch on Hate Speech project together with my students. So we do monitor news, and our students are detecting hateful content in the news. This experience has allowed me to feel that this can be an important tool in countering hate speech, but also it is quite important as an instrument for education. So I'm delighted to be here with you today in this panel as a chair. We have three prominent panelists, and they will all be sharing their own experience. Our first speaker is Giulia Dessi. She is a project manager at the Media Diversity Institute in London. Which is working international to encourage accurate and nuanced reporting on race, religion, ethnic, class, disability, gender, and sexual identity issues in media landscapes. She currently coordinates the project Get the Trolls Out, Countering Anti-Religious Hate in European Media. She is also a researcher, trainer, and freelance journalist specializing in hate speech, discrimination, and disinformation. You're very much welcome. Over to you.
Today I'm going to be presenting an overview of the media monitoring results that came up during our work, and then focus a little bit on strategies on how to counter hate speech. Just some context to say where I'm getting this information from. I coordinate the project Get the Trolls Out, which is run by the Media Diversity Institute, and it is a consortium of eight organizations based in Europe. We are monitoring the media focusing on Islamophobia and anti-Semitism. With these results, then we created debunking articles and resources to raise awareness, and we file complaints against the media outlets and do a range of activities that I'm going to present later on. So now, I'm going to give an overview of the media monitor results, and I'm sure many of you are already familiar with some of these, so thanks for your patience for listening to this again. So the country that we cover are Hungary, Poland, the UK, France, Belgium, Greece, and Germany. So I'm going to talk about some cases in these countries that are not representative of the whole country, but it is what we came across. So in Hungary, pro-government media outlets inflate minor news from Western European media. It is generally France, but also Germany and Sweden, and they do that carefully and exclusively selecting stories about violence that is committed by Muslim migrants. These stories, though, are repackaged to change original meaning, fueling fears in the readers by presenting brutality as the norm. The goal is to promote the government's anti-Muslim and anti-migration agenda, and there is proof that this is done systematically. There was a recent investigation by Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, revealing that there was a pervasive government interference in Hungary's public broadcaster MTVA. So they found out that journalists were receiving specific instructions on how to cover media stories about migration. They had to portray migrants in a negative light. They had to start with the most brutal visuals, then telling the story, and then adding numbers about how many migrants, how many millions migrants are in Europe, and how many millions are on the border arriving. And reporters were prohibited from using the word refugee in any context. In Poland, strong anti-migrant discourses are present in public service media, including extreme versions of the Great Replacement conspiracy ideology. So it is not rare to hear interviewees, which are also supported by journalists, saying statements like, they are not refugees, they are illegal immigrants who are planted in Europe by international conspiracy organizations in order to dilute the identity of European nations. They are terrorists. So these remarks were aired on Polskie Radio 24, which is a public broadcaster. And this Great Replacement conspiracy ideologies is also very well connected with other narratives, so anti-migration, anti-LGBTQ, anti-abortion, anti-euthanasia, and anti-establishment narratives. In Germany, the UK, and also Flanders, Belgium, most of the explicit anti-Muslim stories that we are finding are published in so-called alternative media, so publications such as Political Light in the UK, or Journalisten Watch in Germany, and Doorbraak in Flanders. So they publish sensationalistic stories using aggressive language of war, or like invasion and cultural inferiority. In the UK, tabloids also play a crucial role in strengthening this idea of British nationalistic identity and attack migrants, but you can find also more nuanced articles and also much more explicit and sensationalistic ones. There is an infamous case. It is now from a while, 2015. It was an editorial cartoon published by the Daily Mail, which compared migrants and refugees fleeing wars in the Middle East with rats. So it is an image that recalled the Nazi propaganda against Jewish people. There were maybe some progress, of some positive aspects, is that people like Katie Hopkins, David Icke, and Tommy Robinson, who are anti-migrants and anti-Muslim commentators, have seen a decrease in their following because they have been banned on the main social media platform. So they've been deplatformed, so they moved on to other social media outlets. In France, we have found that the anti-Muslim and anti-migrant rhetoric has been moving in the wide political spectrum, but talking about the far right, I want to mention Generation Identity, which is a far-right nationalist movement that was banned by the government. But before that, they were regularly invited on national TV to express their anti-migrant views. And then a figure that is very famous now, Eric Zemmour, who ran as a presidential candidate in the election earlier this year, is a regular guest on TV shows, and until September last year, he used to have a TV show on C News. And he has been convicted twice for incitement to racial hatred, for saying that most drug traffickers are black and Arabs, and that France has been colonized by Muslims for 30 years. In French-speaking Belgium, Wallonia, there is, and this is also similar to France, we have been noticing national newspaper regularly platforming opinion pieces expressing harmful stereotypes on Muslim women, indicating that those who wear the headscarf are not neutral and they are oppressed. And also in Belgium especially, we've been noticing some stereotypical representation of some neighborhoods, underprivileged neighborhoods and suburbs. So, for example, Molenbeek has been highlighted by the far right across Europe as a no-go zone, and they use this to fuel fears and hatred. Lastly, Greece. It's anti-refugees articles. We notice that flare up whenever there are some incidents on refugees camps, and there are many narratives of cultural incompatibility between migrants, especially Muslim migrants, and native Greek people. We've identified also a number of articles taking France as a bad example where migration is excessive, like the level of migration is excessive. Just another example, a few years ago, the vice president of the Police Union Federation called refugees irritating dust. Before moving on the responses to these hateful narratives, I want to focus on a specific case that is the conspiracy ideologies and anti-Jewish hatred within the anti-vax discourse. We published a report called Anti-Semitism and Anti-Vax in Europe at the end of last year, and because we started noticing the presence of anti-Semitism within the anti-vax groups online, but also on street protests. So we decided to investigate this further to understand the extent of the presence of anti-Semitism, anti-Semitic tropes within the online COVID-19 anti-vaccination conspiracy narratives in Europe. One of the main findings is the Holocaust comparisons. So anti-vax conspiracists often compare the restriction at the height of the pandemic to Nazi Germany and the Holocaust, and they consider themselves to be a persecuted minority within their own country. So examples of this included the reproduction of the Yellow Star of David, which was used in Nazi Germany to identify Jewish people, and they replaced the word Jew with the word unvaccinated. Or in the UK, just only the prospect to have a vaccine passport was enough to label it a new Nazi tool. While in Flanders, those who were advocating for vaccinations, they were called vaxi-Nazis. And in Germany, anti-vax protesters said they felt like Anne Frank. So it's like a very wild comparisons. Then also scientists and medical professionals that were battling the pandemic were compared to Nazi doctors and nurses who were persecuted, who were prosecuted at the Nuremberg trials for conducting medical experimentations in Nazi concentration camps. So clearly, like these comparisons downplay the gravity of the persecution and oppression of Jews under the Nazi regime and anti-Semitism throughout history, denying what anti-Semitism has caused. Another finding is the presence of anti-Semitic conspiracy narratives on Jewish world domination. So one of the most prominent and hateful narrative that has gained popularity among COVID-19 deniers was the New World Order, which is a classic conspiracy ideology, which is now overlapping with new versions, and especially more recently, the one that is called the Great Reset. And according to this conspiracy narrative, there is a global financial elite planning a reset of the current world economic order, and have used or even orchestrated the pandemic as a justification to do so. In all this, we identified anti-Semitic dog whistle or coded language, so words or sentences that might seem innocuous to some people, but they are recognized as specific anti-Semitic accusations by those who are more familiar with them. So, for example, instead of using the words Jewish or Jews, we identify words such as globalist or puppeteers, and in many cases also accusations against individuals that are associated with the Jewish community, such as George Soros. One example from France, we saw the hashtag Qui, which means who, becoming viral, but also being present in placards in the street protest, and it was combined with the phrases, suggestive phrases such as "who is the enemy?" So with the assumption that those who are distributing and profiting from vaccine were Jewish people. So what do we do to counter all this online and offline hatred? I like to outline first three approaches. And these three approaches have been studied and researched a lot in Europe by CSOs and institutions in the past few years. So other than the Media Diversity Institute, also the No Hate Speech campaign by the Council of Europe, the Institute of Strategic Dialogue, the Radicalization Awareness Network, demos, and so on. So I'm going to focus a little bit on this and then move on to illustrate other range of actions. So a counter speech is a way that could be used to respond to hate speech. It is a direct response to the author of the hateful remark. So it has multiple goals. So it rejects hate, exposes and challenges the speaker, shows solidarity and awareness, and also, shows solidarity and support, and also raise awareness among the bystanders, so people who are seeing the online comment but not and the response, but not necessarily engaging with it. So there is the reason why counter speech could be used, and it is important, is because when myths are left unchallenged, can produce more harm, and people who are victim of abuse don't know that there is support out there. However, counter speech is not always effective because it might lead to the production and expression of more hate speech and abuse. Just some examples. So one way is to have a lot of patience and engage into a conversation with someone, playing or using emotions. Does it work now? Yeah, okay, great. So one example is to have a lot of patience and engage into a conversation with someone using empathy. And in some cases, this might bring a change into the view of the speaker, who recognizes the mistake and apologizes. This is not very, very common, but it can happen. But another way is to use humor to show the absurdity of a hateful claim. Or a few years ago, Get the Trolls Out project ran a campaign called Game of Trolls, who recruited the so-called positive trolls. They were volunteers who were trained to respond to hate speech on Facebook using humor, data, and exposing hatred. Then counter-narratives are a more long-term response to hateful speech, so it's a more thought-through answer, and it does the same, raises awareness, challenges beliefs, but is less direct. It's a less direct response to the author. One criticism that has been made on counter-narratives is that it may reinforce the narrative that we are trying to counter, because that stays the main narrative. And some examples could be debunking, which is what we do. So analyze and examine a specific narrative and explain why it is stereotypical, how it is harmful. But other ways are, again, using humor or also using data. But again, using data doesn't always lead to a positive outcome, because for some people, for example, the number of migrants could be, even if it is very low, could be way too many. Alternative narratives are an indirect and long-term response to hateful speech. So it expresses what we are for rather what we are against, and so it doesn't challenge directly the narrative. So how it does it is it changes the frame of the discussion instead of reinforcing it. And again, we can use emotions, humor, and data. Some examples, it was a New Neighbors, was a project funded by the European Commission, which ended last year, and produced and broadcast documentaries on public service media across Europe to highlight the positive social and economic contributions by migrants and refugees throughout Europe. And Get It Rolls Out for the World Religion Day, produced and disseminated posts featuring activists, young activists of different religious beliefs, saying why faith is important to them. So we were not countering hateful narratives directly, but we changed the frame of the discussion. Then I'm going to conclude with other actions, again taken from the project that I've been coordinating. So choosing how to counter hate speech or counter hateful narratives really depends on where the incidents are identified, as well as on your resources. One way, when you come across discriminatory articles in the media, if it is a mainstream media, is to file a complaint. And it's, again, it is not always successful, but we had some successes. So there was a case published in a French-speaking Belgian media outlets on food banks during the pandemic, and they published it with an image with two Muslim women, and that was not the topic of the article at all. So we asked for the photo to be changed, they accepted, and they changed it. Another way is to try to establish a dialogue with IT companies. So we've been producing some reports, some research on hate speech focused on specific topics, and talking with IT companies, and contributed together with the pressure that is coming from a lot of other CSOs. MDI contributed to have some policy change, for example, on QAnon. Now I think it was 2 years ago, and Holocaust denial as well. But also useful to produce different resources. That's what we do, and it's resources for journalists on how to report on religious minorities, but also how to counter hate speech online. Finally, this is all combined with social media content and social media campaigns to engage with young people. But when online engagement is not enough, we also combine it with workshops for young activists. And we also cooperate with community media. So last year we started cooperating with the Community Media Forum Europe, and we are working with a group of community media who are producing content that is offering counter-narratives or alternative narratives and broader perspectives to counter hate speech. So that's all from me. This is how you can reach us. Thank you.
Thank you, Giulia. Our next speaker is Peter Weisenbacher. Peter is eğitimini bilişim teknolojileri alanında tamamladı. 2007 yılında uluslararası
He studied information sciences and he became Amnesty International Slovakia head in 2007, and in 2010 he founded and became the director of the first Slovak Gay Pride, and in 2015 he wrote his first Slovak book on misinformation and fake news. He has published extensively on the topics of human rights, minority rights, international law, and related topics in various Slovak and Czech media outlets. He will be talking about online hate speech in Central European countries. It's over to you, Peter.
Thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure and honor to be here. I will be talking a little bit about Central Europe, at least what I call Central Europe, because there are obviously various definitions. But this is the region of Czech Republic, Slovak Republic, Poland, and Hungary that I consider for at least this occasion. Thank you. Central Europe, and these are the countries that I know a little bit about. They are also sometimes called the Visegrad Group, the Visegrad Four, or something like that. So why these countries? Besides the point that I know a little bit about them, there is we can group them somehow. They have a similar modern history. So the societies are to a large degree heterogenic, with the exception of Roma minority. This means that the society in the many centuries have no experience with ethnic minorities, have very little experience with migration, refugees, or if we want to call the people migrants. And this is showed, among other things, in widespread Islamophobia. This is, of course, in some of the countries, mainly Poland and Hungary, to a lesser degree in Czech and Slovak Republic, fueled by the government and by some media, as the speaker already said. But it would be present anyway. This is something that is spread in the society. There are deep roots, and it can be connected to the historical experience of being really a heterogenic society. So to put it very bluntly, if you are born in a small city, a town, or even a village in Slovakia, and you do not travel, you will never meet someone from with a different ethnic background, not mentioning someone with a different skin color, with a different religion, and so on and so forth. To very simply make a distinction, Czechia and Slovakia are basically working democracies. They are obviously flawed democracies. There are very few countries in the world which are not. But compared to Poland and especially Hungary, Czechia and Slovakia are comparatively good working democracies. It was already mentioned, and it will be mentioned probably more by my colleagues from Hungary, that Hungary is, in my opinion, basically a failing democracy, and it is on its way to some kind of a post-democratic, authoritarian hybrid regime. I don't know how to categorize it. Important is that Hungarian government is systematically utilizing hate speech in its marketing. Once again, it was already mentioned. It will be discussed more. It is mainly visible in the form of anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is one of the avenues that the Hungarian government, it was the same government for the last 12 years, and it will be for another 4 years now, is using as a way of marketing, as a way of propaganda. So, what is the context, and what are the challenging of working with online hate speech in the the region, in my region. First of all, we have to understand, and this was the point when I mentioned similar modern history, we have an uneasy relationship to our heritage of the revolutions, of the overthrowing of the communism and of the Soviet rule in the end of the 80s, beginning of the 90s. It is extremely unpopular and problematic to curtail the free speech. Free speech was one of the main topics of the revolutions in these countries, and it is still being used and misused as a basically as a stereotype. If you want to work with hate speech actively, you want to do something about Islamophobia, you want to do something about anti-Semitism or racism, the first thing that will come from the opposite side is usually the far right. The neo-Nazis, they will say, oh, this is once again, we are coming back to the communist period, there will be no free speech, there will be censorship, and so on and so forth. I don't think I need to explain the falsehood in this, in our meeting. The other problem, obviously, in the last decade is the expansion of the disinformation or fake news websites. Fortunately enough, in Slovakia and Czechia, they did not expand to traditional media. With traditional media, I mean television, stationary radio, newspapers, magazines, and so on and so forth. This is not so completely true for Poland and Hungary, but that would be like a special topic for an hour or two. So I will not go into deep to that. Obviously, now we know. In Czechia and Slovakia, we know for a fact, because this is now being officially investigated, that this is part of the so-called active measures of the Russian Federation. It's once again, it would be for a very, very long time, but now we can take this for a fact. Interesting point, there was already alternative media mentioned here in positive and negative way. When we talk about the Central European region, alternative media is usually the synonym for fake news, for disinformation outlets. We do not have or had for a very short periods of time alternative media in positive sense of independent media as we know it from the US, UK, and so forth, and so on and so forth. Other problems directly connected is that the social media companies, the companies that own the social media, which is basically Meta, formerly known as Facebook, which owns Facebook and Instagram, and Google, which owns YouTube, because Twitter is very, very small, very insignificant. TikTok is beginning to be a little bit more important now. These social media companies are basically failing our countries. The countries are small and comparatively, even Czechia and Slovakia compared to Poland and Hungary, it's small markets, and once again, all these countries are very small when compared to Germany, France, I don't know, UK, even Italy and Spain, when it comes to advertisement revenues, and these are for-profit companies, so the advertisement revenues is the important, so they do not engage with our countries that much, which creates all kinds of problems. You may have heard, maybe yes, maybe not. For us in Slovakia, it was a huge issue when basically in the U.S. Senate it was discussed that these U.S.-based companies are failing Central European countries and are adding to fueling basically the disinformation. Obviously, the reason was political. This was anti-Russia because of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, but as in effect we can see it as a positive development, because at least there is some discussion on it, and there was some action at least in Slovakia afterwards. So what is the current state of play? We fortunately have new legislation which was introduced when we were becoming member states of the European Union. So the legislation, especially in Slovakia, is very good. The legislation when it comes to hate speech, with one exception, and then that is homophobia, in Slovakia is comparable to many Western European countries. Unfortunately, the enforcement of this legislation is more than questionable. We have, and that is not only on the side of the prosecution and on the side of investigation, that means police and a combination of police and prosecution. Obviously, they lack the capacity, they lack the training, there is no support from the government and so on and so forth. But we have also a much more structural problem, and that is an overcautious judiciary. Basically, our courts do not want to make important decision. Although the justice system in neither of the Central European countries is based on the US system of having a precedence, it is still considered to be a huge thing when a judge decides in an anti-Semitism, racism, online hate speech case something. What they usually do is they qualify it as something else and give a small penalty to the party that is being prosecuted. I don't know. For example, there was a trial of a neo-Nazi in Slovak parliament who is also a chairman of the party, and it was very possible that he will go to jail because of anti-Semitism for 4 years. But the highest court in the country changed the decision of the lowest court and said, no, this was not really anti-Semitism. It was just some lighter form of hate speech. I will not give you now a lecture about our legislation. The point is, he did not go to jail for a single day. He just got reprimanded and he was expelled from the parliament. And this is very typical, that the judiciary in the end decides to punish, but to punish very lightly, and not to say this was racism, this was hate speech, this was anti-Semitism. They just say it was some mild form of something else, or it was they broke a law about the communication and blah blah blah. We see a huge discrepancy between what the state is doing and what the NGOs are doing. Basically, it is a fight between a systematic approach and an ad hoc measures. Obviously, the NGOs want to do systematic work in the online hate speech topics, but the countries, the governments are only willing to do some special measures. This could be very well illustrated in the repercussions of the war in Ukraine, on the Russian aggression against Ukraine. In Czechia and Slovakia, all the Russian media were basically banned. Most of the websites that were pro-Russian were banned, made illegal. Most of the social media channels have been banned as well, because there was a lot of political pressure on the social media companies. Once again, the process was very much top down. It happened from one day to another, and it could be even argued if it was legal. I will obviously not advocate for disinformation media outlets, for websites that are spreading hate and racism and anti-Semitism, but I would always advocate for the rule of law, and I am afraid that what happened in the end of February in Czechia and Slovakia was not, at least to some degree, lawful with the banning of Russian and pro-Russian outlets. We have to also think about the mainstream media and on their presentation online, as was already mentioned. The tabloids, I mean the whole media landscape is changing. COVID only exacerbated this. printed newspapers are basically and magazines are basically dying out, so they are moving their business online, and these media companies, with very small exception of non-profits, are owned by for-profit business companies, and they are once again usually owned by multinationals. So their aim in existing is not to report the news, their aim is not to report the facts or to, I don't know, even improve the society, but their aim is to make money, because they are for-profit companies. And when they move to online sphere, the tabloids usually use hate speech, because it's highly clickable, and it can be used in many ways. As was previously mentioned, there could be a quote that could be used as a headline. It could be used in quotation mark. It could be used without them, but still it is adding to the hate speech online. So moving of tabloids to online sphere also adds to hate speech a great deal. A way forward, to end on a positive note, I hope, and hopefully have some time for questions. What we are trying to do, and what we can do, and what we think should be done. First of all, there needs to be international coordination, because, as mentioned, our countries are very small and in the greater scheme of things basically insignificant. So if we want to have a regulation, and there should be a regulation, once again, as opposite to what happened in Czechia and Slovakia with the start of the war in Ukraine, that a government agency came and said this, and this is prohibited from today on, no discussion. There should be process. There should be a proper way of handling these things, and to that end we need binding definition, internationally binding definition of, for example, what is anti-Semitism, what is not anti-Semitism, what kind of falsehoods can be spread online in media, and what is considered a harmful disinformation and could be considered hate speech and could not be widespread, because once again there are things that are, even everyone knows that they are not true, prohibiting them, such as, I don't know, the flat earth theory would not serve the society, but would only create a bigger rift between basically the so-called elite and establishment and the supporters of the disinformation outlets. But there are other things that are harmful, and we need binding definitions of these things and enforceable targets. And with that I mean, for example, something like in Germany, the owners of the social media companies have different time frames, 12 hours, 24 hours, and so on and so forth, to act, and in some cases to delete content. We do not have anything similar like that in Central Europe, and we need that. And you can see from the logos where I am looking for the international coordination and regulation with my hopes. Also, there is a need for cooperation between official bodies and NGOs. Once again, it should start with communication and with effective exchange of information, because, for example, our NGOs was talking very publicly and asking the government to step and to basically regulate somehow those outlets that have been banned in the end of the February, but that they have been banned 10 years too late. Unfortunately, they made a huge harm to Slovak society, and similar situation in Czech Republic. The question is if there should be institutional support of NGOs. I myself am not decided on this question, because on one hand it's good for the sustainability. On the other hand, there is the very bad example of Hungary, where some NGOs, but mostly media, have been made basically dependent on the government by the institutional support. Once again, very complicated topic will not go into detail, but it is an open question for me. There is the sustainability versus independence of NGOs. In our opinion, as Human Rights Institute, the prevention is always cheaper than repression, and one of the best ways of prevention is human rights education, formal but also informal. We mostly do informal human rights education, and repression, once again, what I mentioned about February of this year, should be used only as a last resort. It is not part of the solution. It is basically an evidence of the government bodies failing when the repression needs to be done. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Soruları panel
We will collect questions after the third speech. Now we will move on with the next speaker. Suat Atan from Ankara University, Department of Management. He has a thesis on text mining and financial markets. And he completed a postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Torino with a scholarship he received from the Italian government. And he is teaching part-time at TED University. And he has published 3 books in his field of the study. He works on machine learning algorithms to tackle hate speech with the turnusol.org project. He is a graduate of Factory Bootcamp organized by Teit.org, and he continues to work in this field. He will be talking about testing the use of artificial intelligence to detect hate speech, turnusol.org. This will be an online speech. Good morning, can you hear me? I wish I was there physically, but since I'm in Ankara, I will participate online. I'm so happy to be a part of this conference. Thank you for the invitation. And I greet everyone. I listened to Giulia and Peter. I would like to thank them individually, because their speeches set the basis for my speech. I will be talking about artificial intelligence to detect hate speech, specifically in Turkey. I'll talk about religious minorities, refugees. So this will be a Turkish perspective. But having listened to anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, the situation in European countries, I think this is going to be a good time to give you a perspective concerning the situation in Turkey. I will try to share my screen right now.
Slaytlar görebiliyor.
I hope you can see my slides. So let me briefly talk about what turnusol.org is. So I will talk about the challenges of such a work using AI. I'll talk about the pros and cons, and I'll talk about algorithms, how they play a role. And for those of people who want to learn something about this, the NGOs or individuals, I want this to be useful for them. We see the use of AI in many fields, but when it comes to a very specific field such as hate speech, it's relatively not very much used. And around the world, in different countries, we know that such activities are taking place, and we try to follow up on them. So, turnusol.org or Teit.org is a fact-checking platform in Turkey. So, we had a boot camp. During the boot camp, I learned about this. I got support from them in terms of shaping the application. This was important. Why did I want to design turnusol.org, this fact-checking website? We know that there is quite a lot of content on hate speech, and it's very difficult to monitor them. But classifying the news is very, very important and valuable. And the AI is currently helping us in that area, but the manual analysis might be slow. So if you try to detect the hate speech manually, then some news can spread very fast and you cannot take the necessary preventions or measures. So the news spread so fast. That's why algorithms are very, very important, and that's what we are trying to do at turnusol.org. This can be very fast. It doesn't require any human power. So, of course, there are some restrictions of the algorithm as well. Let's talk about them. Because regarding the algorithms, there is a lot of positive praisal about algorithms. But then there are certain limitations of the algorithms. And all these praises make people think that you can do anything and everything with AI. Yes, it's true, you can do so many things with AI, but then there are the limitations of the algorithms. Analysis is something that can only be done by humans for the time being. So we have to, that is why, talk about the restrictions or limitations of the algorithm. We have about 300 national and local newspapers that we monitor through turnusol.org. We scan them 5 times. So on an everyday basis, we have 2,000 pieces of news. So it's very difficult to follow up and monitor them manually. That is why we need such an algorithm. And if you include social media, the news, comments under the social media posts, if you also include them, it's too much. In the reports, we don't include them. Otherwise, it's a scale that we cannot cope with. But you might ask, can you not monitor on Google? No, at the end of the day, Google is also an algorithm. You can only list them on Google. But the words we type in, only some of the results regarding the keywords we type in can be accessed through Google. Some websites are neglected, and maybe those websites also contain hate speech and fake news. So we gather news on a regular basis. Since the beginning of the pandemic, we have collected more than 2,000 pieces of information. The algorithm doesn't openly present it to you. It's under my access. So if you want, I can share it with you. But this is not an open access page. So all the news are gathered on turnusol.org. All the news. Why do we collect them? We collect them because when there is any research to be done on hate speech, for instance, hate speech on refugees in Turkey, if you want to have a specific research on it, instead of finding all the data one by one, going back and browsing in past history, you can just go into this archive and get all the information you want. So it makes analysis easier, be it manual analysis or algorithmic analysis. It's both ways are possible. So I'll talk about some algorithms. Through them, you can summarize the news and identify the news that have potentially hate speech content. All the news here are kept in text, not in number. For instance, in the text, maybe refugees are mentioned ironically or directly through hate speech. So all of it is kept on text format. People always say X zettabyte, Y zettabyte, and 80% is kept in a text format. And you can have simple words, word groups, or word clouds can be created. For instance, coronavirus. During the coronavirus, we came up with this word cloud that you see on the slide. These were the most frequently used concepts in the media. For instance, the most important one, the most frequently used one was coronavirus. Then lost their lives was another word. open was another word. So that was a hot topic on the agenda. And on the media, as mentioned by Ülkü Doğanay in her speech in the beginning of this conference, on media, there are so many news covering minorities, but during the coronavirus period, for instance, we didn't know what words were used, so we can see it here. And not only words, but also the content of the news can be seen here. And the reason of this is to train the machine to identify fake news and hate speech. So potential hate speech can be identified or guessed by the algorithm. This is important because if you want to identify the news containing hate speech through an algorithm, this can be used as an early warning system, or you can make comparison between the years to see if the hate speech has increased or decreased. So in terms of measurability, most importantly, maybe, this is very important for hate speech studies. We can also measure the impact of hate speech efforts or anti-hate speech efforts, if they work or not. So to what extent all these anti-hate speech efforts have an impact on media? To what extent was it reflected on media? So I think this is also very valuable. This algorithm is also very valuable for measuring that impact. And also, in the same way, at the end of the day, maybe in a far future, this can be accessed as open source data. That's what I'm planning, actually. So in terms of the data, speech data, surveys, online surveys, for instance, the gray sides are that the sample is vague, there is manipulation. This is true for content analysis as well. Sometimes all the content cannot be covered in your study, so there is a bigger mass that is left outside your scope. And then you can get unrealistic results. But doing the speech analysis through algorithms avoids manipulation, and it includes the entire scope. Then we have a tool called ADYA, the tool to identify distinguishing language, in short, in Turkish. We call it ADYA. So it makes a scoring and makes an estimation, a guess, on distinguishing language. For instance, if there is a speech, distinguishing speech for women or other disadvantaged groups, there are other keywords for different groups. Because the word of a hate speech statement used for a certain minority group might be a different word than the words used for women, for instance. So the ADYA tool that you see on screen indicates an example. When you copy and paste in this box on the left-hand side any text, here the algorithm scans all the hate speech dictionaries and glossaries that contain thousands and thousands of words. So it screens them immediately and highlights the words that contain hate speech. And every single element here, is it a simple insult, or is it a term containing hate speech, or is it a behavior? It identifies this, and based on this, it comes up, it calculates a hate speech score. So the algorithm calculates a hate speech score, and the news that could contain hate speech can immediately be scored, graded like this, and thanks to the score, we have identified so many news so far that contain hate speech. Of course, it's more important what to do after you identify a certain text as containing hate speech. So, after reporting, rather than reporting, for instance, it's also important to see what kind of a reaction we should give against hate speech. So what kind of action should be taken against the media outlets that publish this? So this algorithm, this tool to identify distinguishing language. For instance, this tool, Adya tool, is not very successful in terms of speech against women. Because in Turkish language, we have specific terms that certain groups want to avoid. For instance, some people say we shouldn't use the word lady, for instance. So is lady considered as distinguishing language or not? We need to have more data. And another thing, as far as I can understand from the developments on hate speech, it's during war times, for instance, before the Ukrainian war, we have seen it in the Karabakh crisis. And on this graph, you see a result of the algorithms, a benefit, for instance, which websites, news websites covered these topics the most. Very interestingly, as you can see on the graph, Yeni Çağ newspaper covered 1,411 news. They did not all contain hate speech, but the top 3 news sites you see here frequently used statements containing hate speech, and it was not a coincidence, of course. Apparently, certain issues are covered more specifically by certain news outlets, and they all contain hate speech. And some of the news outlets, they don't even pay attention to certain topics. For instance, on the right-hand side of the graph, you see websites that have made only a few news coverages about the issues. So this was one example. We went through the websites based on this, but it gives you a lot of important information. One newspaper, one particular newspaper's level of interest or disinterest in a given topic is shown here. So the news on Nagorno-Karabakh, what did they contain? On the left-hand side, you see the concepts, the terms that are frequently used. And here on the x-axis, you see the frequency of those terms being used. For instance, Armenia is the word that is most frequently used, naturally. And then occupation and attacked. These two terms might change based on which side you are. So different news websites use different terms. But then again, you have other expressions called Karabakh, etc. But the most interesting thing is that after this process, the cliché terms that are expected in news terms are used, but then we have terrorists, martyrs, massacre, heroes, lame, genocide. Such words are also frequently used, but these are irrelevant terms, right? So all of them are based not only on legal terms, but based on the momentarily decisions of the editors of the newspapers. Some newspapers use these terms very carefully, but some others use them randomly without even paying attention very frequently. So different news websites are using these terms in the most frequent way. So when we counted the terms, these were the most frequently used ones. So another example. When collecting these news, we also have to talk about what constitutes hate speech and what does not constitute hate speech. This has to be identified very clearly. You can get a text in your hand, and when you, as a human, look at a text, you can identify, based on the context, if it contains hate speech or not. But for the algorithm, that's different. If you're talking about machines or AI, you need to clearly identify certain statements as hate speech for the machine to understand this. Because sometimes a statement alone will not be a negative thing, but when you take it in context, it might include potentially harmful speech. Here we have the example of children's news. For instance, we have scores that are identified as problematic against children. Some of the news are not problematic, for instance, but it captured them because of the certain words used. But sometimes, on the contrary, these are against news against children. So, when carrying out hate speech analysis, Turnusol does not specifically select one topic like only women, only minorities. No, it selects all hate speech examples. Or principles of good journalism were taken into consideration. And we also see fake news. Currently, it's being experimented. When there is any fake news, the algorithm can make a guess, as you see on the screen. A forecast, let's say, just like a weather forecast. It makes a forecast. Is it fake news or not? Then it makes you an estimation. It says most probably this is fake news or misleading information. And the user might look at it and say, I agree or I disagree with the algorithm. The green box or the red box you can click. But of course, my main takeaway message here is the following. We had a few items in these studies. First, the fuel of AI studies, or the most important element that we must have, is data. Data means labeled data. What does it mean? Just to illustrate, if you want this forecasting algorithm for a hate speech, then you need to have thousands and 10,000s of pieces of real hateful speech in hand. You need to have like 10,000s of news that are clearly identified as hate speech. Then you need to have 10,000s of news that are clearly identified as non-hate speech statements. Then, so that the algorithm can make the distinction between the two groups. So, even if you have analysis, if the use of language in the news change or the politicians' use of language changes, then it's sometimes changing also what hate speech is. Like hate speech might also change, let's say. So this is not a fully automized system. It will be partially hybrid. These algorithms have to be subject to training, learning through certain periods of time, and then the remaining of the period they will work on forecasting. So lack of data is an important challenge that we have. We need to have so much data so that the machine can learn from it. So media monitoring activities, the academic work are very, very valuable for the provision of data. And they should be turned into a format that could be processed by the AI. I think this is very important. And at Turnusol, this is still the bit that I need the most. The labeled training data is important. This data can be taken through voluntary activities. That's what I do, or I had to obtain them myself. So, what changed about the language? The power of algorithm identifying the hate speech weakened after the elections in Turkey. Very interesting fact for me, because we have the scores, correctness scores. During the elections we can monitor it, but during the elections the speeches of the politicians are very obvious, very sharp, so you can identify the hate speech easily because you know who says what very clearly. But their discourse, their speech changes after the elections. They might use vague terms. So we have this issue of vague terms. We have some glossaries for the vague terms. Based on literature, you look at the facts, and for the professionals in media, we have these list of terms that should be used and that should be avoided, for instance. So my biggest challenge working on these terms was that, for instance, a list of terms prepared by a certain CSO was different than a list prepared by another CSO. So what one CSO considers to be a word to be avoided is not considered as a word to be avoided by another CSO. I think there should be a standard here so that AI activities will be easier. And then flexible language. Issue of flexible language. Most recently, I had a study on this. Through Turnusol, volunteers tagged 2,500 news on distinguishing language against women. So I use this as a labeling data or tagging data, but the algorithm was very weak. It could identify only up to 52% if it really constituted a distinguishing language against women or not. But on the contrary, about refugees, ethnical and religious minorities in Turkey, it's much easier. What I'm trying to say here is the news itself is a different field. Some fields might still be difficult for the algorithm, but for anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, or some minorities in Turkey, for instance, when we talk about algorithms, like I'm interrupting, but can you please wrap up because we are running out of time? Okay. So in summary, what I'm trying to say that in such activities, development of algorithms require collaboration. We need collaboration and cooperation to develop these algorithms. So all the institutions working in this field come together. And with that, I would like to thank you, and this is all for my presentation.
Teşekkürler.
Thank you very much indeed. We will be able to have a very brief Q&A, perhaps one or two questions. We have listened to different experiences about countering hate speech, the obstacles before those struggles, as well as various techniques that have been developed. If you have any questions, we will now be ready to have those. Talking about algorithms, they would always miss something. Do you have any statistics how much those algorithms would miss out things? I have been previously engaged in a study on hate speech, and it became very clear to us that it is almost impossible to catch the sarcastic language or this element of sarcasm. So you need to manually detect those. So do you have any statistics on that? Thank you very much. This is a very critical question indeed. As you have mentioned, when it comes to news about women, the algorithm was not really successful. I mean, the outcome was 52%, but I mean, it is just 50-50. You could reach out to this conclusion with a simple tossing of a coin. So for women, minority rights, we could, for minorities, we could see that this went up to 60 or 70%. So we could detect more content. However, as for the element of sarcasm, I mean, it is possible to find it manually. I mean, you will still need to do a second reading. And we use two parameters. One is those with hateful content but not detected by the algorithm. So these may be news with ironic or sarcastic language. And then there is another parameter or category which is a content that does not include hateful narrative but still detected by the algorithm. So we can also come across with such rhetoric, but as you have rightly mentioned, so sarcastic or ironic language may be problematic in detection. I have a question. As a result of all these efforts, what kind of transformation you observe, if you observe any transformation at all? And another question, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, all these social media platforms, what expectations should we have from these social media platforms? If we can hear very briefly from you.
Şeyde konuş
For instance, in your speech, you have talked about the discourse transformation or campaigns, and as a result of these campaigns, you would observe some transformation which includes the discourse itself.
Our impact, it is something though that it is very difficult to understand the change of behavior in people. So when you are addressing people on social media or in workshops as well, of course, like you hope that you're having an impact, but in many cases you don't know. So we have ways to monitor the result of what we are doing. But I think it's mainly in terms of like changes of policies on social media, as I was saying before, or whether it is someone from a workshop then goes on and does a campaign, or a complaint that is successful, something is removed. But I think it's something very slow, and it is really a concerted effort of a lot of NGOs working in this field. So I think transformation is, maybe it's difficult to see it in society. Maybe you have like specific cases that you can see, okay, yes, in this case I had an impact, or for social media. Otherwise it's very difficult.
Thank you. Peter, is there...
Yeah, I mean, what I can say from what we do, that's mainly informal human rights education, and we see impact among the young people, because the aim of the informal human rights education basically is to step forward of the extremists, of the slippery slope of extremization, and to basically prevent young people to become the fans of racism or anti-Semitism or whatnot. When it comes to the social media companies, I really think what I already mentioned a bit in my presentation, that we okay. I'm really sorry. I thought it was working. So the social media companies should reflect more on the laws and the legislation, and there should be an effort to communicate with the countries. And if it is not possible with individual countries, there has to be international cooperation, because the social media companies now are not only private-owned for-profit companies, but they are very important actors on societal, political, and even cultural levels. So I am definitely not a fan of the sanctity of private property, and there should be even punitive measures considered by our governments, by the European Union, and by other international bodies if the social media companies will not comply and will not be active, because we know for sure there has been these leaks, for example, from Facebook, that they know themselves that they are helping to spread hate speech, and they know that it's very profitable. And they made a decision, and it was not one decision, and it was made on a very high level, that they will tolerate this because it's good business. So basically what the governments need to do, what the international bodies need to do, is to make this less profitable for the companies. There should be penalties, there should be some other measures how to basically get them to cooperate.
Thank you. Suat Bey bir iki cümle söylemek ister
Tabii
misiniz
ki,
siz de?
evet. Kesinlikle
Yes, I also would like to respond to that. Once hate speech is detected, there should be a monitoring effort, and very clear conclusion for me is that concerning misinformation or misleading or deceptive news items, then the algorithm should include some disclaimers or notifications about the misleading content. And indeed, you may remember that Twitter used such a disclaimer and also blocked President Trump. So social media platforms should clearly mark these type of content that include misleading or deceptive narrative or news. For instance, on YouTube, you can see many videos about migrants, refugees. No one really flags that this video content might be misleading. So, through these algorithms or other means, this misleading content should be flagged, and it should be clear and visible to the audience. Thank you very much. Thank you very much to all panelists who joined us online and physically. We also would like to thank our participants. So at 12, we will continue our discussion on disinformation, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, anti-immigration and anti-Roma movements. We will now break for 15 minutes. Thank you very much.